In 2018, the Trudeau Liberals passed the controversial Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, which introduced a tax on carbon emissions with the stated intent of mitigating and reversing the human impact on climate change. Whether you want to call it a carbon tax, as the Conservatives and most Canadians do, or a quote-unquote price on pollution, as Trudeau prefers, there's no doubt that this has been the flagship policy of the Justin Trudeau government. It has been hotly debated, with many economists and Conservative politicians raising concerns that it's nothing more than a tax grab that will hurt the Canadian economy while doing nothing for the environment. For our first episode of our 4-part investigative series, Green Hypocrisy, we investigate this tax, take a look at its origins, and learn about its effectiveness. Despite being a significant legislative aim of the Trudeau government, many Canadians don't know what this controversial tax actually is, who it is imposed on, or how it works. We learn this by going straight to the source and talking to Canadians.
What is a carbon tax and how does it work?
I don't know. We don't have idea.
Carbon tax. No clue.
I honestly couldn't even tell you.
I have no idea, to be honest.
Man, that's a big one. I don't
So it turns out that many Canadians don't quite understand what this tax is all about. We figured we'd go to an expert to get a better understanding. Aaron Woodrick is the Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, a citizens advocacy group that has been one of the leading voices against the carbon tax. We asked him, what is a carbon tax?
It's an additional charge that is based upon the carbon intensity of a product. So if you buy something like gasoline, which is the obvious example, it just means there's an additional tax based on the amount of carbon in whatever product that is. So again, we use gas as the most common example, but it really applies to anything really that's shipped on a truck, because trucks use gas. So it is a sort of widespread new tax, almost similar to sales tax in a lot of ways. And we all know something called the law of supply and demand, which says the more expensive you make something, the less people are going to use it. So the theory is if you make gas more expensive, people will use less gas. That's good for the environment. Where the theory really sort of breaks down is there's something called elasticity. There are some things that are necessary for people to do, and so they are likely to continue buying it even if the price goes up. And things like gasoline are pretty inelastic. So, if you have to drive to work, or if you live in a place where there's no transit, you have to pay for gas. So even if the price of gas is $1 a liter, $1.50, $2, you're still going to do it. So you don't actually reduce the emissions, but you do increase the cost to use.
We also spoke to Dr. Jack Mintz, one of Canada's most distinguished academics in public policy, who currently serves as the President's Fellow of the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. Given that his specialty is focusing on Canadian tax policy, we figured he'd be the perfect person to speak to about where the idea of carbon pricing comes from.
The concept behind taxing carbon emissions or GHG emissions goes back to an Italian economist by the name of Pugu, who had talked about the idea of taxing pollution, or what economists will call externalities. The idea isn't to drive production down to zero. The idea is to simply get producers to take into account not only their own individual costs or internal costs of producing a product, but also any damage that they cause to the rest of society. And that would be the idea of putting on this tax that would take into account that damage. Of course, it requires governments to measure the damage and know what the value of that damage is. And that is not a simple exercise, but that's really where the whole concept really started with.
It's important to note, however, that this is not the first time a carbon tax has been proposed in Canada. Stéphane Dion, former leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, predominantly ran on an environmental plan back in 2008. It was known as the Green Shift, and it included a national carbon tax. Endorsed by celebrity environmental activists like David Suzuki, the plan was to tax greenhouse emissions starting at $10 per ton of CO2, reaching $40 per ton within 4 years, while simultaneously reducing income taxes. Not all, however, were impressed with Dion's plan. One trucking association in New Brunswick pointed out that the tax would jeopardize over 10,000 jobs in the Moncton area alone and cost the industry another $500 million per year. Similarly, Prime Minister Stephen Harper warned that the green shift would threaten national unity and the economy, warning that a carbon tax would be an economic catastrophe for Canada that would plunge the country into a big recession like the one in the early 1980s, while doing nothing but shift more money and more power to Ottawa elites. Ultimately, voters agreed with Prime Minister Stephen Harper and the Conservatives as they increased their seat count and their share of the popular vote, while Stéphane Dion was forced to resign as Liberal leader after leading the party to one of their worst showings ever. The concept of a tax on carbon is not unique to Canada. It was brought into law in Australia by Labour Prime Minister Julia Gillard in 2011. As part of that country's energy reform plan, known as Clean Energy Futures Plan, Gillard wished to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% below 2000 levels by 2050 by taxing carbon, encouraging Australia's largest emitters to increase energy efficiency, and investing in sustainable energy. The carbon tax was a key part of this scheme. However, it did not work out as planned. In 2012, the Sydney Morning Herald, which is Australia's largest and most widely read newspaper, reported that the carbon tax scheme did not defer investment in the coal industry, one of the most notorious polluting resources. In fact, spending actually increased by 62% in 1 year, despite claims by Gillard that it would have had the opposite effect. Australians were skeptical of this tax. There were widespread protests across the country, and Australia's Liberal Party, led by Tony Abbott, opposed the tax, claiming it would penalise legitimate businesses, cause job losses, and force an increase in energy prices. Abbott made repealing the carbon tax a key part of his platform. Similar to Canadians' opposition to Stéphane Dion's carbon tax, this gamble paid off, and Tony Abbott's Liberals formed government, defeating the Labour Party and proceeding to scrap the carbon tax the very next year.
What we've seen in Canada is that governments are using regulations and subsidies to a large extent because carbon taxes are not leading to emission reductions. And that's not surprising because carbon taxes cannot guarantee emission reductions. The economists might estimate that they will lead to some emission reductions, but that's a lot different than saying actual emissions fall, because it's not just the carbon tax that might influence emissions. It also depends on the state of the economy, whether the economy is doing well and you have growth in the economy, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're now seeing a whole plethora of different regulations coming in, such as trying to stop resource development, clean fuel standards, or building retrofits, et cetera, et cetera. And we're also seeing subsidies being brought in. Some of the subsidies, like ethanol production and electric car vehicles, having a very high carbon price per ton of reduction in carbon. And so what we are actually seeing, unfortunately, is all these different policies, and then we're just heaping carbon taxes on top of them. It's unfortunately turning more into a tax grab, and now being funded to either provide rebates or go into public services now, or the general budget of the government.
It isn't just policy experts like Dr. Jack Mintz that think this carbon tax is not only unhelpful to the environment, but also damaging and destructive to our economy. Premier Doug Ford in Ontario and Premier Jason Kenney in Alberta were both elected running openly opposed to Justin Trudeau's carbon tax, with a plan to take it to court in an attempt to recognize that it is unconstitutional for interfering in provincial jurisdiction.
We cannot afford the risk of a carbon tax recession, because the truth is clear. You can be for a carbon tax or you can be for jobs, but you can't be for both.
We had a cold winter this year. Many families were paying an effective carbon tax of 75 or 80% on gas to heat their homes. We have small businesses putting online carbon tax bills of $800 or $1,200 a month. This is really hurting our economy, and it's all just a cash grab.
The Canadian Taxpayers Federation has been one of the leading voices against the carbon tax, citing how it disproportionately hurts rural Canadians and believing it just makes life more difficult for families and businesses, while again not really helping the environment.
If you live in a large city, if you don't own a car, if you can get around without a vehicle, if you work at a job that doesn't involve any types of inputs that are carbon intensive, you can benefit from this. You can definitely be better off. If you live in a rural area, if you have no choice but to drive, if you work in an industry like agriculture that uses a lot of carbon intensive inputs, you are probably going to be worse off. And the rebate makes up for some of that, but it does not contemplate a lot of scenarios, and people, the cost of energy for them, cost of gasoline alone in a lot of cases, it just goes through the roof. So it really hits people very differently depending on your lifestyle and what line of work you're in. Our Constitution lays out which level of government has what powers. And something like climate change, as you can imagine, in 1867 was not an issue. So when they drew up our Constitution, it's not covered clearly. So the debate is, who has the power to do this? Is it Ottawa or is it the provinces? And the arguments that the provinces made is the nature of this power is more similar to things in the provincial column of jurisdiction than the federal. And so their argument is Ottawa actually doesn't have the power to do this. We just last week were at the Supreme Court, who will have the final say on this. So they're going to have to try and reconcile these competing rulings. It's actually quite remarkable. It's quite divided. Courts are quite divided on this. There were 15 justices in the 3 provinces that looked at this. 8 of them ruled that it was constitutional, and 7 of them ruled it was unconstitutional. So it is quite, there's quite a bit of division in courts over this issue.
If policy experts like Dr. Mintz and advocates like Aaron Woodrick are right that this tax hurts Canadians, then who really benefits from this?
At the federal level, the federal government brought in the carbon tax, where rebates are given to households. Very little to businesses, by the way. And so it helps deal with households in terms of, at least on average, households actually are maybe even a little bit better off because they're getting some of the subsidies that probably should go to businesses to deal with export and import competitiveness pressures.
Approximately $2.6 billion is collected from the carbon tax. But where does this money actually go? According to a 2020 report by the Parliamentary Budget Officer, about 90% of the revenue collected from carbon taxes, which equals about $2.34 billion, is recycled through household rebates. Another 10% of the revenue collected from the carbon tax, which is about $260 million, is used by the government to fund green energy projects and other projects that do little to help improve Canada's environment. We'll be looking at these programs in more detail in a later episode. And as is the case with most government taxes and regulations, some of the largest emitters actually benefit from the way the existing national tax is imposed. It turns out loopholes created by the Trudeau government allow businesses to receive rebates that means that they pay no carbon tax at all. So while everyday Canadians are being punished for just doing their day-to-day activities, some of the biggest corporations get off scot-free. Despite overwhelming evidence suggesting that the carbon tax doesn't really help the environment and it really doesn't help the taxpayer, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is doubling down. If you thought one carbon tax was bad enough, get ready for the Trudeau government's second carbon tax. In the middle of the coronavirus pandemic, while unemployment numbers reached historic highs, while the energy sector continued to struggle, Trudeau pushed forward the introduction of the Canadian Fuel Standard, a regulatory regime that will require all suppliers of fossil fuels to reduce their carbon content. Yes, it's basically a very bureaucratic way of saying another carbon tax.
They are bringing in what we're essentially looking at as a second carbon tax called the Clean Fuel Standard. And it's essentially like the carbon tax, but hidden and much more expensive with no rebate. So it's basically even worse. I think they've lost the plot on this policy and they're sort of scrambling to make up for it. And I worry that the result is just going to be a huge cost for Canadians.
This new tax grab will cost between $150 and $180 per ton of carbon emissions. By comparison, the first carbon tax is capped at $50 a ton. The new carbon tax will be even more expensive and more devastating to Canadian business owners and Canadian taxpayers. Meanwhile, the government will continue to lecture us about climate change. As documented in a 2020 Fraser Institute report that analyzed the carbon pricing schemes in 31 OECD countries, Most governments are using carbon taxes as revenue-raising tools rather than a mechanism to internalize the negative externalities of emissions in a cost-effective manner. Carbon taxes are meant to replace all other climate-related regulations. However, the results show that no high-income OECD country has used carbon pricing to repeal emissions-related regulations, but instead have introduced new regulations alongside carbon pricing systems. So where are we going with all these regulations, taxes, and government interventions?
There are people on the left, of course, who might argue actually that carbon taxes won't be sufficient to reduce emissions, and they would like to see much bigger actions taken. That would be regulations or whatever that would actually force emissions down faster and more quickly. And also some people on the left look at this as an opportunity to reorganize society, although that really goes well beyond the greenhouse gas emission agenda.
In our next episode of Green Hypocrisy, we'll be looking into the promises and failures of the global climate activism movement.